The first time she slammed the door in my face, I thought it was just anger, a momentary flare of frustration. I had asked a simple question, something that I assumed any partner would be willing to answer honestly, and instead, she recoiled as if I had physically struck her. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a bad day, but the cracks began to appear, widening subtly at first, then forming gaps I could no longer ignore. I never imagined that asking questions meant to understand, not accuse, could lead to something so serious, something that would ultimately escalate into a restraining order. It began with ordinary things, small inquiries about her day, casual questions about who she was meeting, what her plans were for the weekend, nothing intrusive, nothing unreasonable, but slowly, over days and weeks, my questions started to make her anxious. She flinched, withdrew, and became terse. I remember one evening vividly. We were sitting on the couch watching a show, and I casually asked her about a message she had received earlier that day. Her face tightened, her eyes hardened, and she turned away sharply. "Why do you always have to know everything?" she snapped. I froze, startled. This was not a reaction I had anticipated. My mind raced. Was I really overstepping? Had I somehow crossed a line without knowing it? But at that moment, the first seed of tension that would eventually spiral into a restraining order was planted. In the beginning, I tried to rationalize her behavior. Maybe she was stressed at work. Maybe there were personal issues she hadn't shared. I gave her space, told myself I was being patient, and assumed that time would ease the tension. But the messages and interactions became sharper, more guarded. She began leaving the room abruptly when I asked for clarification about simple matters. Her texts became clipped and defensive. Each small question, each attempt at understanding, now felt like a threat in her eyes. I found myself treading lightly, carefully measuring every word, every tone, every inquiry. A question about a friend's visit or a work event could spark a flinch, a sigh, or a terse remark. "Some questions aren't safe to ask," she would say, and her eyes would avoid mine. I didn't understand how we had arrived at this point. I only knew that my desire to communicate, to connect, and to understand had begun to be interpreted as controlling, invasive, and potentially harmful. Then, one evening, the situation escalated in a way I could never have predicted. I asked a simple, casual question about a plan she had mentioned earlier, a plan that involved meeting someone she considered a professional acquaintance. Her response was cold, almost dismissive, and then, within moments, she pulled out her phone and began typing something that would alter our lives. Hours later, I received notice. She had filed a restraining order against me. The legal document cited harassment, intimidation, and emotional abuse, all based on my questions, my curiosity, and my attempts to engage in normal communication. I was numb. My first reaction was disbelief. How could this be happening? How could something as innocent as asking questions, something that anyone might do in a normal relationship, now become evidence of wrongdoing in the eyes of the law? My mind spun through the previous days and weeks, replaying interactions, analyzing each conversation, searching for a point where my behavior might have been misinterpreted. But the truth was simple: my intentions had never been harmful. Yet that detail mattered little in the legal narrative she had created. The next days were a blur of fear, anxiety, and logistical nightmares. I contacted an attorney, explained the situation, and was warned that restraining orders are often granted on the applicant's testimony alone, even without evidence of physical threats. Anything I did, sending a text, attempting to call, even approaching her, could now be construed as harassment. My home, which had once been a place of comfort, became a cage of uncertainty. Every interaction outside of the legal boundaries felt like navigating a minefield. Friends and family tried to offer advice, but the isolation was profound. It was terrifying to realize that normal human curiosity and communication could be recast as threatening behavior, and that my entire life had to be measured against the potential consequences of that perception. The most mundane acts, sending a polite text, asking a question about plans, or even trying to understand her emotions, were now fraught with risk. The emotional toll was overwhelming. I lay awake at night, heart pounding, imagining scenarios in which I might accidentally violate the restraining order. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I had somehow contributed to the escalation, whether my questions had been too probing, too persistent, too intrusive. I replayed conversations in my mind, scrutinized texts, and agonized over moments that had once felt ordinary. The isolation was compounded by the children's awareness of tension. They noticed the silence between us, the abruptness of interactions, and the invisible barriers imposed by legal restrictions. They asked gentle, innocent questions: "Why can't we see Mom?" Or "Why don't you talk to her anymore?" Each time, I struggled to respond honestly while protecting them from fear. Their innocence became a mirror reflecting the absurdity of the situation, how quickly normal relationships could unravel when perception and misinterpretation became amplified. Reddit became both a refuge and a source of validation. I read countless stories from people who had experienced similar situations. Relationships where innocent curiosity or concern was recast as controlling behavior, where boundaries were weaponized, and where restraining orders were filed based on perception rather than tangible threat. The narratives were chilling yet familiar, echoing my own reality. These stories advised meticulous documentation, saving texts, keeping records of interactions, noting dates and times. I began cataloging every message, every email, every moment that could possibly be used as evidence. Conversations became strategic rather than spontaneous. The intimacy of communication, once natural, transformed into an evidence-gathering exercise. I had to think about how every action could be interpreted in a courtroom, how every word could be reframed as threatening or harassing. And that awareness made normal life feel alien and constrained. Every attempt to reconcile was met with resistance. Letters drafted carefully through my attorney were returned with formal, impersonal responses. Attempts at dialogue were refused. She maintained the narrative that my questions were harassment, and the restraining order remained a constant reminder of that perception. Family gatherings became tense. Friends tiptoed around conversations, and children learned to suppress curiosity about what had once been open and natural communication. The world became a series of careful calculations, a landscape in which freedom of expression and natural inquiry were regulated and limited. Even casual gestures of care or concern could be scrutinized and potentially misrepresented, leaving me constantly vigilant, constantly second-guessing every move, every word. Months passed, each filled with court dates, affidavits, and depositions. The process was exhausting. Each session demanded precision, patience, and careful articulation. Every question I had once asked out of care now had to be contextualized legally, framed in a way that emphasized non-threatening intent. The emotional burden was immense. Feelings of injustice, confusion, grief, and frustration collided with the requirement for composure and professionalism. The very act of defending myself became a full-time occupation. I felt like a stranger in my own life, a participant in a narrative that had been written for me without my consent. The restraining order had transformed a personal relationship into a legal battlefield, where the subtleties of emotion and intent were overshadowed by formal procedures and rigid interpretations. The impact on the children was profound. They felt the tension, absorbed the anxiety, and sometimes expressed it in ways that were confusing to me. Maya, perceptive beyond her years, would ask gently why normal conversations could no longer happen, why we had to communicate indirectly or through lawyers. Jonah, more innocent but equally affected, would plead for our family to be normal again. Each time, I was reminded that the consequences of the restraining order extended far beyond the direct parties involved. It affected our ability to maintain a nurturing, emotionally safe environment. Protecting the children became paramount, and I learned to navigate the intersection of legal compliance and familial responsibility with care. Every interaction, every word, had to be measured not just for my own safety, but to shield the children from the fear and tension that permeated the household. The restraining order also forced deep introspection. I began reflecting on human communication, perception, and boundaries. I realized that questions, no matter how well-intentioned, can be interpreted differently depending on context, personal history, and emotional state. Intent does not guarantee understanding. Relationships are fragile, and miscommunication can escalate rapidly. I learned to consider not just what I intended to communicate, but how it might be received. This awareness, though painful, became an essential survival tool. I documented everything, moderated every interaction, and approached every conversation with deliberate thought. It was a harsh but invaluable education in the complexities of interpersonal dynamics under legal scrutiny. When the court hearing finally arrived, the tension was almost unbearable. Sitting in the sterile courtroom, I felt the weight of months of anxiety, confusion, and fear. The judge listened to testimony from both sides, examined evidence, and asked questions about intent, perception, and interactions. The proceedings were meticulous, formal, and emotionally draining. Each statement I made was carefully framed to demonstrate concern rather than control, curiosity rather than intrusion. The experience was exhausting but clarifying. It forced both parties to articulate their experiences and perspectives, to acknowledge the subjective realities that had led to the restraining order. While the process was far from ideal, it offered an opportunity to assert my truth within the boundaries imposed by the law, and to begin navigating a path toward resolution. After the hearing, a slow adjustment period began. Boundaries were clarified, communication channels were formalized, and the restraining order remained in place as a structural framework to prevent escalation. Life continued, but it was different. I became acutely aware of how perceptions shape reality, how fear can distort intentions, and how legal mechanisms, while necessary for protection in some cases, can also be wielded in ways that create profound personal disruption. The experience taught me to approach every interaction with mindfulness, to recognize the impact of my questions, and to respect the emotional boundaries of others, even when I felt those boundaries were being misapplied. It also underscored the importance of resilience, patience, and careful navigation in the face of legal and relational challenges. Through all of this, I discovered the capacity for adaptation and introspection. I learned to manage anxiety, document interactions meticulously, and navigate relationships with heightened awareness. I recognized that even in situations where accusations are unfounded or exaggerated, the consequences are real, tangible, and emotionally taxing. The restraining order reshaped my daily life, interactions, and even my thought patterns. It forced me to develop strategies for communication, reflection, and emotional regulation. While it was a painful, almost surreal experience, it ultimately became a profound learning experience in human psychology, law, and the fragility of trust. I also reflected deeply on the broader implications. The story is a cautionary tale about perception, boundaries, and the subjective nature of fear. In relationships, what seems harmless to one person can be threatening to another. The experience revealed how quickly misunderstandings can escalate into legal action and how the tools designed to protect individuals can also create immense challenges for those falsely accused. It emphasized the importance of empathy, clarity, and deliberate communication, as well as the necessity of understanding how our actions might be interpreted in different contexts. These lessons, hard-earned and often painful, are now embedded in how I navigate interactions and relationships. Over time, I began to rebuild my life around these lessons. I approached the children with care, reaffirming love and stability despite the turbulence. I approached the adult relationship with measured communication, documenting carefully and respecting formal boundaries. I learned to balance curiosity with caution, desire for understanding with acknowledgement of perceived threats, and emotional honesty with strategic restraint. The restraining order, while a painful marker of misunderstanding, became a framework for practicing disciplined communication, emotional intelligence, and resilience. It forced me to confront difficult truths about human perception, fear, and the complexities of interpersonal dynamics. Even now, reflecting on this experience, I realize that it is a story about more than just legal conflict. It is about the fragility of trust, the subjectivity of perception, and the consequences of miscommunication. It is a reminder that intentions, no matter how pure, are not always sufficient to guarantee understanding or safety. It is also a story about resilience, the ability to adapt, to navigate legal and emotional challenges, and to maintain integrity and care in the face of misinterpretation. While the restraining order reshaped my interactions, it also provided opportunities for reflection, growth, and the development of new strategies for communication and relationship management. In sharing this story, I hope others understand the delicate balance between curiosity and intrusion, care and control, and intention and perception. Asking questions is natural, human, and necessary for connection, but how those questions are perceived can have profound consequences. Legal tools like restraining orders exist to protect individuals from genuine harm, but they can also be invoked in ways that create fear and disruption, even when intentions are innocent. The experience highlighted the importance of documenting interactions, respecting boundaries, seeking professional guidance, and approaching conflicts with care, mindfulness, and patience. It also emphasized the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to adapt, and the importance of preserving emotional stability in challenging circumstances. Even months later, the restraining order continues to influence my life. Every interaction is approached with thoughtfulness, every question framed with consideration for perception, and every conversation weighed for potential misinterpretation. The experience has left scars, but it has also imparted invaluable lessons about human behavior, law, perception, and resilience. It is a cautionary tale, a story of survival, and a narrative about navigating relationships, fear, and misunderstanding. I carry it with me not as a source of shame or defeat, but as a guide for how to approach communication, empathy, and human connection in the most challenging circumstances. This story, while painful, is ultimately about growth. It is about understanding that actions can be misinterpreted, that perception can redefine reality, and that resilience is essential when facing unexpected legal and relational challenges. It teaches that even when falsely accused or misunderstood, there are strategies to maintain integrity, protect relationships, and navigate life carefully and thoughtfully. The restraining order did not end my curiosity or my care. It simply taught me to approach questions with caution, reflection, and a profound respect for the subjective experiences of others. In the end, this story is a reminder that human relationships are fragile, communication is powerful, and perception is everything. Asking questions, seeking understanding, and attempting to connect are natural instincts, but they exist within a context of individual perception, emotional boundaries, and legal frameworks. Misunderstanding can escalate, intentions can be misread, and actions meant as caring can be interpreted as threatening. The experience taught me patience, reflection, and the careful navigation of relationships under legal constraints. It also highlighted the resilience needed to continue to love, care, and engage thoughtfully, even in circumstances that seem unjust or bewildering.